Our second MC for the second half of our morning session is Bob Ferguson. Bob has 26 years of Capitol Hill experience, having worked in both the House and the Senate. He served on the House and Senate Republican Study Committees and was chief of staff to 3 different congressmen. He has lectured and written widely in climate change science, mercury science, energy and mining, forests and resources, clean air and the environment. Please welcome Bob Ferguson. Bob?
Thank you. You left out my most important accomplishment, and that is convincing my wife to marry me. It is really an honor and a privilege for me to introduce Willie soon. I can tell you with absolute sincerity, he is a deep, close, personal friend of mine. He's almost like a family member. I mean, after all, when someone has their own bedroom in your house. We have, over the last decade, tromped the hills of the offices of Capitol Hill many times on climate change, on mercury, trying to defend science against these scare tactics that push legislation that can be harmful to many people. He's been absolutely tireless. We have briefed congressmen, senators, staffers, people in different departments of the administration, the vice president's office, and Willie has always been what he is, which is honest and without guile. Few people, you can see in your program, I mean, one of the most important things, of course, he's chief science advisor to my organization, Science and Public Policy Institute. But he was an outstanding student at the University of California. Received many awards, had the best thesis award. But what people don't know are some of the other things about Willie I'd like to share with you. He holds the record at the University of California, excuse me, for being the person who slept in his office and lived in his office longer than any other person. That was 4 years. Don't even ask. I look at him myself in sort of a biblical reference of several people. He reminds me often of Paul before Agrippa, staunchly defending what he believed to be the truth and presenting it with courage. And Willie is a very courageous person. Those of you who know him may know he suffers an awful lot of persecution, even from the institution where he is, just because he believes in the science and defends the science. So he's really had to put up with a lot, as have other people. He also reminds me of John the Beloved, because as I said, he is a man without guile, and he's truly a kind person. And finally, he reminds me of the man from Galilee himself, that he is not afraid to walk into the courtyards of the Temple of Science and kick over the table of the money changers. The only time I've seen Willie perplexed, and he is a brilliant, brilliant man, is one morning on Capitol Hill, early morning breakfast with him and me and Dick Lindsay. And Dick and I fell into this conversation about the place of hell in Jewish and Christian literature. Willie was terribly perplexed about that, but seemed to learn something. And you may not know, but he is monotheistic. Willie worships but one God, and that is Rabbi Lindsay. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to a very courageous man, a good friend of mine, Dr. Willie Soon.
Oh boy, oh boy, oh boy. Thank you very much, Bob. Thank you so much for all these kind words and nice description about me. It's all true. Thank you. Well, before I start my talk this morning, I do wanted to report to you my little slight incidents with Mr. Gore. That's happened about 5 days ago at Santa Barbara. And remember, I'm really doing it not for myself, meaning having the opportunities to ask the first questions among so many years that all of us has been waiting and waiting and waiting. And for me personally, I guess my idea of wanting to ask Mr. Gore a question started about 4 or 5 years ago. So after waiting for 4 years and then got about 3-4 minutes out of that time, I asked him, after I tried to explain myself and saying who I am. In fact, I have to repeat my name 3-4 times. My name is Willie soon. And so I ended up asking him the question, Mr. Gore, what will we get by cutting CO2 emission? He was extremely unhappy with that question. And he was doing all his facial expression that is, I think, rather obvious even to the crowd. But he ultimately answered by saying, well, it's to have the chance of saving human civilization. How about that? And I'll propose, before we start this talk this morning, is to say that, how about all of us trying to save human civilization from being destroyed by Mr. Gore and all his other scientific untruth. Just one little last thing that is fairly special to me today, because my wife and my son has the opportunities to be here as well, so I'm fairly proud of this. And my son's always wanted to be a Caillou, the cartoon character, so that's why I'm forced to have this particular look. All right. Okay, that's it. That's enough. All right. My task today is quite straightforward in a lot of sense, because many of you have done it many, many times better than I can possibly do. But let me just give you a bit of my personal perspective after looking at this subject of climate science. And in my particular area, I happen to also focus on what the sun is actually doing and how it might possibly be connected to our Earth climate system itself. But with another short disclaimer that I like to make is that I have nothing to disagree with Professor Lindson's call about these issues about climate variability and climate change. That the first order of business would be the null hypothesis should be that it's all internal variability. But my little understanding from rather mature by now, I would say, after 20 years, is that perhaps when I started to look into the issues of the plausibility of how the sun can affect or connected to the Earth climate temperature, and it is just so happened in my humble opinion that the pattern of change and variabilities and all these time scales involved is so rather coherent and synchronous in so many different regions, like things happening in Arctic could be found in a cave in Oman or places in China or even sediment in Caracol Basin in Venezuela. So in that kind of empirical basis that I felt that, well, perhaps there are something there to say about the role of the sun in this picture. So therefore, I do try to say that, well, there are some interesting progress that I'm trying to do, and many of you as well, in terms of trying to explain the physical mechanism or the relationship between how the sun variability is related to Earth climate system. Let's put up the view graph, please, because yeah. All right, my task today is really try to make this simple point about try to remove politics from science from the perspective of sun climate studies that I've been focusing on for the past 20 years. The first point that I wanted you to take home with is indeed the ICCC fourth assessment's discussion on solar forcing is undeniably political and is absolutely political. It's nothing but political. So, second point. The second point that I wanted to emphasize is indeed to tell you that this magical CO2 knob that Mr. Gore and some of his friends has been promising, it just simply does not exist. Meaning, they essentially are telling us that emitting CO2 in the atmosphere is definitely a bad thing. And then there is this control knob that if you just simply sort of tune the knob a little bit or not emitting CO2, then the climate all of a sudden will become better for everyone. And in this particular example, I just wanted to use a very interesting example, meaning just to point to a particular location, an urban city, and here I'll use Salt Lake City. And this is also sort of in terms of showing that how high the current level of CO2 in the free air, and yet we can find no signature of warming at all, actually even in Salt Lake City. So that itself poses a very serious challenge for all this current movement in all these various cities and states across the United States and even the world, about all the cities is trying to do something about global warming, as if they will get something out of it. And they will absolutely get nothing out of this little exercise. And finally, of course, I want to say that the sun is not yet dead. The research on the sun-climate connection is clearly making a bit of progress, and I do my best to try to show you what I mean by that. So let us start. Let's just be absolutely clear. According to the agenda of these real climate folks, that the issues about the sun is the absolute number one skeptic lies, okay? I'll propose that if they're talking about climate change, if it's about CO2, that will be the number one lies, really. And then I was a bit upset, actually, by reading this particular statement from our current president of the U.S. National Academy of Science, which is Ralph Ciceron. And you have heard yesterday from Dick that how he got into become a member and president of National Academy of Science, which is a backdoor effort. Apparently, Professor Ciceron has thought that the sun-induced climate change theory is no longer viable. And I'll propose that the basis of his argument is really highly misinformed. It's mainly from this sort of statement coming from the IPCC fourth assessment, and I was very precise, of course, it's chapter 2, section 2.7, page 188. And it is about a statement like this, okay, that says that, the previous estimate, the TAR means the third assessment report, which is produced in 2001, that has been revised downward based on new studies, and those studies refers to Hall and Lockwood, which are two of my colleagues, and then Yiming Wang, which is also a scientist at the Naval Research Lab that I know very well. And I was very puzzled by those statements itself. Okay, so this is clearly that something that is not quite true. And unfortunately, I was not able to participate in this process of fourth assessment because it is truly tiresome, because after going through all this effort of trying to help them in the previous assessment, I mean, you know that they won't change anything. So that's part of my bad news. So here's actually what is being shown in the IPCC fourth assessment. They're trying to present that, well, we now have a new curve, which is that the purple curve versus the old estimate, that's showing you now, wow, we have all these new results that is strong in scientific evidence in terms of its argument and procedural qualities and all that. That's a very substantial change. If this were to be true, of course, I would support it immediately, okay? But here's the bottom line problem with that kind of results. That study that was being attributed to Yiming Wang of a Naval Research Lab is essentially a model result that has no radiative transfer module in the computer code. Just imagine this. Someone is telling you that, okay, we have this new result that's going to change everything that previously estimated. By the way, those are observational based results, partly related to some of the work that I've done in terms of the sun's variability and how a group of sun-like stars, what we call the sun-like stars, is changing in terms of their magnetic output and their light output. So we've been coming out with a result that sort of shows the estimates, the larger amplitude change. But all of a sudden, someone came along using a magnetic flux tube transport model that contained no radiative transfer and trying to tell you that they have now put a good physical constraint on how the solar irradiance has changed, and you ought to change your results, your input function. That's clearly a very, very illogical statement even, okay? So that's my first point on this. Then as I started to look more carefully into what happened here, and it turns out that my conclusion is that the whole IPCC fourth assessment report was mainly corrupted by one or two of the lead authors in that chapter. Here in particular, if you don't mind me, I'll just state it out loud, it's perhaps by Judith Lin of the Naval Research Lab, because she's one of the first but the lead author on the IPCC report. And it turns out that in 2001, Lin and David Ryan from the NASA GIS happens to produce such a graph, okay? It is one of those perspective papers in Science magazine that is not peer-reviewed. And apparently what they're trying to tell everybody is that, well, they not only know what the sun has been doing for the last 400 years, that they even know what the suns will be doing for the next 20 years or so into the future. So they're providing you some very nice graph about the sun's irradiance going up and down a little bit, ever slightly so, but then to encourage your eye to make sure that you know that you can see this, please make sure you see this, because they put this shaded region, the purple areas, and then showing that downward trend of the sun's irradiance in the next 20 years or so. And then, of course, the contrast, the main point of the article is indeed to try to say that the sun not only cannot do anything for the past 50 years or 350 years to the climate, but that in the next 20 years or so, we can absolutely be certain that the sun will not be doing anything at all in comparison to all this CO2 emission scenario, all this CO2 radiative forcing. That's quite brilliant, actually, in terms of a political strategy. And I was really annoyed by this particular paper, this particular note, and it's very well cited, by the way, okay? And let's now figure out what that mark is. What is that downward trend? It turns out that this is truly one of those most embarrassing things that I usually rather not say it, but then you just have to say it because these people are crazy. No, the crazy point is that downward trend is basically taking the point at the top there, which is year 2000, and the low point of 2017, and connect them together to tell you that they have this sort of downward trend. Before I really show you this, I have checked with about 4 of my colleagues, make sure that my English is not wrong, because English is really not my first language. And I just puzzled by that kind of behavior and that kind of results. And these are the folks who physically go around and telling Ralph Cicerone, because Judith Lin, by the way, is also a member of the National Academy of Science and elected in year 2003. And notice also the quality of such kind of paper, that it was published in the Geophysical Research Letter, and this is a record publishing time of 6 days, from receive to acceptance. It's really one of those amazing stuff that you wonder what happened to the peer review system, according to Governor Sununu, about trying to strengthen the process of peer review. In my strong, humble opinion, for the last 10 years or so of going through all this hustle of printing your papers, I mean, we have a system that is truly bad. It is pure endorsement system, is no peer review at all. It's just boring, really. And now let's come to some statement that I was rather surprised to find from Judith Lin herself. And that statement was made in 2003, the year that she was admitted to the National Academy of Science. And again, my team here is trying to remove politics from science, but this shows the political anger from most of her, quote-unquote, I call it work. And she said that the fact that some people could use this Wilson, okay, that would be Dick Wilson from JPL, Jet Propulsion Lab in Pasadena. She's also affiliated with Hansen's group in NASA GIS, that shows increasing total solar irradiance, which is TSI. That the fact that some people could use Wilson result as an excuse to do nothing about greenhouse gas emission is one reason that we felt we needed to look at the data ourselves. They have been looking at this data for a long time. This is clearly another untrue statement. Since so much is riding on whether the current climate change is natural or human-driven, it is important that people hear that many in the scientific community don't believe there is any significant long-term increase in solar output during the last 20 years. And guess what she replaced that by, right? She replaced that by this sort of downward trend. Just to make sure you understand, of course. And let's see how Dick Wilson answered. It would be just as wrong to take this one result to use it as justification for doing nothing as it is wrong to force costly and difficult changes for greenhouse gas reduction per the Kyoto Accords, whose justification using the IPCC report was more political science than real science. Notice we have to emphasize real science. Here's another manipulation from the IPCC fourth assessment that I find it truly, truly appalling as well. The reason is maybe not so obvious, so let me walk you through some of this, this chart that's being put up by IPCC fourth assessment. This is figure 6.5 on page 451. What is being shown here is so-called the radiative forcing, net radiative forcing values for the role played by orbital changes in the sun's energy input to the climate system, which they show to have high scientific understanding, but very, very low amplitude. And then the CO2 and the methane and N2O effects and all this other stuff to be extremely large. Okay? And this is for a condition in which that the difference is between the warm period, the Holocene, to the last glacial maximum. And my note here is that indeed this is a very dangerous and damaging politics, because here they are trying to bypass all this well-known stuff about Milutin Milankovitch, who has formulated this theory of orbital climate change. Has been known for a long time, because Milutin Milankovitch has said this, ever since his theory was ever understood by anyone and himself, is that the whole thing has nothing to do with all this net radiative forcing or whatsoever, okay? The whole truth is that for last 1 million years, if you look at just the annual mean global radiative forcing, which is at the top panel here, the net change of the radiative forcing is no more than 0.6, and of course here only accounting for the geometrical effects of the orbits. But the whole original idea, the basis for Milankovich's idea, is that perhaps the coming and going of the ice ages is controlled by a particular a sensitive latitude. Here, for example, is 65 degrees north. That would allow the incoming solar radiation to be very, very powerful in terms of modulating how the ice sheet is receding away. Let's say having a slightly higher summer insolation, okay, that will melt the summer ice a lot more or a lot less depending on how high or how low the summer insolation or solar radiation is. And in the units of, in this particular perspective, one can see immediately that the forcing, the radiative forcing introduced by CO2 or methane or what have you, of 2 to 3 watts per meter square is minuscule compared to this huge amplitude fluctuation that is really the idea of Milutin Milankovitch. So to present the case and to summarize in this sort of convenient cartoon is clearly a political effort to try to say that, well, this whole idea of orbital theory, climate change, I mean, it has, the role of the sun has nothing to do with it. It's mostly all CO2 and all these trace gases. So that's really a very serious problem in my opinion. Let me now move on to the subject on this idea of we having that CO2 control knob in the climate system that we can tune up or down to try to make Al Gore warmer or colder. What I'm showing you now is just a monthly sort of resolution. This is weekly resolution data collected from Salt Lake City. And I guess you can see the value of the carbon dioxide concentration here is running from about 360 to about 500. In fact, some of the value goes clearly to the roof of 600 ppm or so. And this is covering the period from February of 2002 to about February of 2009. And what are we seeing here? And I plotted the red dashed line is actually the free tropospheric value of 380 parts per million or so. And what we're seeing here is basically a phenomenon that is sort of rediscovered by our friend here, Craig Itzo, and his thesis advisor, Robert Bolling, on the issues of basically the notice that in our current urban city, that you have such a phenomenon in which that the level of the carbon dioxide in the air itself is extremely high. Depend on the time of the day, depend on the season, depend on what the condition of the soil condition perhaps. And what we are seeing here is the condition of how the inactive biosphere during winter and let's say perhaps even early spring is not able to soak up most of the carbon emissions that we do emitted out. That's true. This is clearly a man-made effect. that because the winter and the spring biosphere is inactive, so you're not able to soak up all of this carbon dioxide that we emitted, so there's a lot of them remain in the air, so you have all these high values. But as soon as the summer comes, as soon as the biosphere is active again, guess what happened to the CO2 level? It came all the way back down to the free tropospheric value, and in some occasion, is even lower than what the free tropospheric value is. What this point to is indeed that this large urban cities phenomenon, this CO2 dome phenomenon, is caused by inactive CO2 sink during nighttime and during winters. So the problem here, it has nothing to do more, it's a lot less to do with the CO2 emission source than the sink itself, all right? Because no matter how much we emit, if we do have a sort of appropriate way in which the system can soak it up, they will soak it up. The system is starving by not having enough CO2, in my opinion. This is why part of the reason why I asked Mr. Gore that question is that what if that your proposal to drastically cut CO2 emission lead to a drastic drop in the atmospheric CO2 concentration? And then we know that CO2 is not an air pollutant, it is food for plant and marine life. Then who will be responsible for that sort of ecological disaster? That is the kind of thing that I'm leading at when I ask him that questions. Of course, he absolutely will refuse to answer that kind of questions. So let me move on by just finish up with this stuff on the Salt Lake City viewpoint. Here, I just wanted to be absolutely sure to point out that, 1870s, you clearly don't have the urban city. And then by, of course, the modern era, we have all this urban development that is changing the landscape, blah, 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 that you have this high CO2 condition in the urban city that we have today. Of course, the ultimate test is then, are we seeing any drastic or warming to the roof of the winter temperature in Salt Lake City? Here I just take this sort of data from NASAGIS, and I did try to confirm with my colleagues, David Legates, and I try my best to confirm with Anthony Watts to see if there's anything wrong with this data set. But the point is that this data set couldn't show me any winter warming at all. So imagine all these mayors and all these governors and all these states governors saying that we're going to have this movement, that all these different cities and states, we're going to cut all this CO2 emission. Guess what? They already have a clear empirical test on this. They're not going to get anything out of this. So that would be a very, very sad and futile effort, in my opinion. Let me now switch pace. Okay, yeah, well, this is something that I happened to see, that I was attending some kind of a recent global warming rally. And guess what? Mr. Gore up here. And he's still unhappy. And he has some crowds listening to him again. All right, now let me switch subject. This is the last part of my talk, which is to show you a little bit, a hint about some of this work that I've been doing on sun-climate connection. It's obviously that I have a very limited time, so I would encourage most of you to write to me or come up to me to try to read some of my latest paper on this issue. So I'll be very brief here. I will start with just this view graph that I usually show. What is being shown here is basically the Arctic surface air temperature from about 1960 to 2000. And then on top of that, I overlaid with the CO2 atmospheric concentration level. In this particular picture, clearly, and in fact, the reason why I do this is basically that you clearly have seen in several presentations by some of those IPCCs and perhaps even Al Gore and folks are saying that, the last 50 years, absolutely we know that it's CO2 driving, the global temperature change, therefore, the Arctic temperature change as well. But that's obvious cheating. Even my son would know how to do that. But it's obvious that when you have the full picture, it's really extremely difficult to explain this very large warming in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s, right? When you have such a low level of CO2 increase. And then on top of that, you got this cooling tendency that is fairly obvious also from the 40s to about 70s or so, while your CO2 is rising rapidly. So I would say this is only 1 out of 3. So, getting a 30% in your test is not very good. So the same picture is being shown on the right, and then The best estimate of the solar irradiance is actually on your left. And if you smooth the surface temperature by 10-year moving averages, you explain up to 75% of the variance. So this is a very significant sort of correlation, no doubt. And then to further show you some insights that why that I think this particular correlation has some meaning, in the sense that it has some physical relationship that is worthy of some sort of a formulation of a scientific hypothesis, which I did, that I'm showing you. On top of that, the top picture is the same picture, but the smooth temperature curve, but with the CO2, the solar curve overlay with that, which is a red curve. But in the 3 other panels, I'm showing you all the different sectors of the Arctic region. So it's the Atlantic sector, the Pacific sectors, and the Greenland and Icelandic sector. So you have a very sort of a coherent signature of this sun and temperature relationship. Finally, even on a scale of local and regional perspective, one can indeed find that kind of fingerprint. That on station like Gotap Nut, on west coast of Greenland, or Ammassalik on the east coast of southern Greenland, you can clearly also see the hint of solar imprint on this business. And to try to think about why is it so, I have thought about this for a long time. Okay, what I show you, of course, is statistical correlation, and we all know that correlations are all nothing but lies, right? So the whole idea is that, do we have a better way of seeing this, of trying to explain why the sun must be so important? This is basically what I can come up with, and I'm taking all that information more or less derived from IPCC so that it won't be any controversy. I do not agree, of course, with some of their estimates on the sun's irradiance change, no doubt about that. So what I'm trying to show you here is that when we think about the sun versus the CO2, we're talking about gorilla versus Willie soon, really. Okay? That's a very serious comparison, which is quite accurate. This is the way now I would try to tell you that why, the sun must be absolutely overwhelming the climate system compared to CO2, for example. Imagine little guy like me, Willie Soon, trying to push a climate system, which is Tom Brady. I mean, Tom Brady is quite a tall guy too. He's quite heavy. He clearly can take me for a spin, really. This is the kind of the notion in which that, you can imagine the climate system is pushing on the CO2. This is the notion that you get out of basically saying that you can emit all you want, but the ultimate amount of CO2 that remain in the air is still controlled by climate in some sense, because the rate of change of the atmospheric increase of CO2 in the air is controlled by the temperature itself. That we can demonstrate that. Even Charles Keeling knew that already in 1995 and warned people that we should be very careful. Just knowing how much you emit doesn't mean that we know how much is going to stay in the air. That's absolutely clear that we cannot make that sort of a prescription. So let me get back to my graph, because I wanted to introduce you to Refrigerator Perry. I hope some of you know this, of course, but that's the last time I watched American football. That was in about 1980s. To be honest, the correct way of explaining this is actually to putting out a picture of gorilla, but gorilla doesn't play, football. So I just have to take this best example that I can find, which is Refrigerator Perry. He's the sun. Even if he increased by this little tiny 0.2 pounds, and then even if I increase by 1.7 pounds, it's clear, or whatever units you want to use, clearly that is not going to be very substantial in terms of my increase to try to force the system to behave up and down according to, Willie Soon. This guy, even though it changes ever so little, will be ever much more so powerful, because the absolute level in which this sun is controlling the system is very powerful and dominating, really. Okay, with that, I thought I'd just report to you that all these reports about the death of the influence of our suns on climate has been greatly exaggerated. And I thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Nicely done, Willie. Talk about energy.